My name is Zuri. I am 29 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful public relations agency owner, I worked tirelessly to escape their toxicity, yet I maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of obligation. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale dinner in Buckhead to celebrate my older sister. Between the expensive steaks and vintage wine, my mother leaned forward, clinking her glass with a smirk. She announced that I would be signing over my 6-bedroom mansion to my sister as a baby gift. My father immediately backed her up, threatening to take me to court if I refused. I had already paid $247,000 in mortgage payments on my own. What they did not know was that my attorney had already uncovered a massive $470,000 debt scheme they were hiding. Soon their own lawyer would be running away from the negotiating table, pale and sweating. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our Atlanta suburb meant projecting an image of Black excellence to outsiders. But inside our home, emotional coldness and blatant favoritism permeated every corner. Our house was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. From elementary school through college, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and worked multiple jobs just to get a fraction of the approval my parents freely showered on my older sister, Deanna. She was the golden child, coddled and protected, while I was expected to shoulder my own burdens in silence. The ambush happened at a high-end steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead. The restaurant was dimly lit, filled with the soft murmur of wealthy patrons, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the low hum of jazz music playing in the background. I had arrived straight from the office, still wearing my tailored blazer, exhausted, but willing to make an appearance for the sake of family peace. Deanna was sitting across from me, 34 years old and 6 months pregnant, resting her hands on her belly with a perfectly practiced look of delicate innocence. Next to her sat her husband, Trayvon. He was 36, wearing a flashy designer suit that screamed new money, even though I knew for a fact he had not held a steady job in 2 years. My parents, Brenda and Desmond, anchored the ends of the table. We had just finished our main courses when the atmosphere shifted. My mother, wearing her finest Sunday church dress and a string of pearls, picked up her silver spoon and gently tapped it against her wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. I looked up from my plate, wiping my mouth with a linen napkin, expecting a toast to Deanna's baby. Zuri. My mother began, her voice dripping with that artificial sweetness she always used when she was about to demand something outrageous. Your father and I have been talking, and we have come to a beautiful decision as a family. We know how hard you have worked, but the Lord blesses us so that we can bless others. Deanna is bringing my first grandson into this world, and she needs a fresh start. I smiled politely, taking a sip of my sparkling water. That is wonderful, Mom. Are you and Dad helping them put a down payment on a new place? My mother let out a soft, patronizing laugh. Oh no, sweetie. We decided that you will be signing over your house in Buckhead to Deanna and Trayvon. It is the perfect size for raising a family. You can move into a luxury apartment downtown. It makes much more sense for a single woman anyway. The water nearly caught in my throat. I set my glass down on the thick white tablecloth, staring at my mother to see if this was some kind of elaborate, twisted joke. But her face was completely serious. My father was nodding in agreement, cutting a piece of his steak without even looking at me, as if they had just casually decided what I should order for dessert rather than demanding the surrender of my real estate. I am sorry, I said, keeping my voice low and measured. You want me to give my house, the 6-bedroom mansion that I bought with my own money, to Deanna? Before my mother could answer, Deanna reached down into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, glossy manila folder. She slid it across the table toward me. Her eyes were wide, playing the excited, expectant mother perfectly. I have already been looking at Pinterest, Zuri, Deanna said, her voice breathy and enthusiastic. I want to knock down the wall between your home office and the guest room to make a massive nursery. And the dark hardwood floors in the living room are a little too gloomy for a baby, so Trayvon knows a contractor who can rip them out and put in light oak. I brought some color swatches for you to look at. We are hoping to have the deed transferred by the end of the month so we can start the renovations before my third trimester gets too uncomfortable. I stared at the folder sitting next to my plate. The sheer audacity of the gesture sent a cold wave of shock straight through my chest. She was not asking. She had already mentally moved in, measured my walls, and planned the destruction of my sanctuary. Trayvon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The dim lighting caught the gold of his bulky watch, a cheap fake Rolex I had spotted the moment he sat down. He smirked, exuding an unearned arrogance that made my stomach turn. "Let us be real, Zuri," Trayvon said, his voice laced with condescension. "You are single, you have no kids, you spend all your time at your agency anyway. What does a single childless woman need with 6 bedrooms and a pool? It is selfish to hoard that kind of space when your own flesh and blood is trying to build a family. You should be happy to help your sister out. You. Step up and do your part for the family legacy." The anger did not explode out of me. Instead, it crystallized into a sharp, icy focus. I looked from Trayvon's smug face to Deanna's expectant smile, and finally to my parents who sat there waiting for me to comply, like I always did when I was a child. In that fleeting moment of silence, my mind flashed back over the last 5 years of my life. I thought about the 80-hour work weeks I endured to build my public relations agency from a single laptop in a cramped studio apartment into a multi-million-dollar firm. I thought about the nights I fell asleep at my desk, the panic attacks, the missed vacations, and the sheer relentless grind of securing high-profile clients. I sacrificed my 20s to build an empire and buy that house. And where was Deanna during those years? She was dropping out of a private university that my father paid for in cash. She was crashing expensive cars and crying to my mother, who eagerly dipped into her retirement savings to cover the damages. When Deanna racked up $50,000 in credit card debt flying to Miami and Dubai with her unemployed friends, my parents took out a second mortgage to bail her out. They never asked her to take responsibility. They never asked her to struggle. She was the golden child forever protected from the consequences of her own actions. And Trevin was just the newest mistake they were trying to sweep under the rug, a smooth-talking scammer who charmed his way into the family and immediately started living off my parents' generosity. My father finally looked up from his plate, sensing my hesitation. He pointed his steak knife at me, his eyes hardening into a glare. "We are not asking for a favor, Zuri," my father said, his voice dropping into the authoritative boom he used to terrorize me as a teenager. "You will sign that property over to your sister. If you want to be stubborn and ungrateful, we will take you to court. I co-signed on your first little condo years ago, which means I have an equitable interest in your financial success. You owe this family. Sign the papers this week or we will force the sale legally." He was talking about a tiny apartment I bought at 22, a loan I had paid off entirely by myself within 3 years, before selling it at a massive profit to fund my agency. He had no legal standing, but he relied on fear and intimidation to keep me in line. For 29 years, that tactic had worked. I had always backed down. I had always swallowed my pride to keep the peace. But looking at them now, sitting around this luxurious table, demanding the keys to my kingdom as if it were their divine right, the last thread of my familial loyalty snapped. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt an overwhelming, powerful clarity. They were not my family. They were parasites, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. "No." The single syllable left my mouth with absolute calm, slicing through the heavy air of the restaurant. I did not raise my voice, but the finality in my tone made Deanna flinch. My mother's artificial smile froze on her face. "Excuse me, Zuri. I know you did not just tell me no." I looked directly into her eyes. I said no. I am not giving my home to Deanna. I am not signing over my deed. I am not financing her life choices, and I am certainly not subsidizing her husband. Before my mother could gasp in feigned shock, my father erupted. Desmond slammed his heavy fist down on the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses violently clinked together, and the silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. Several heads at nearby tables snapped in our direction, the quiet hum of the restaurant coming to a sudden halt. But my father did not care. He had always used public intimidation to force my compliance, assuming my desire to avoid a scene would make me surrender. You listen to me, little girl, he hissed. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble vibrating with pure rage. You are going to sign that quitclaim deed, or I will drag you into a courtroom so fast your head will spin. You think because you have a fancy little agency you are untouchable. You are not. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching a vein pulse in his forehead. On what legal grounds, Dad? On the grounds that I own a piece of everything you have built, he shot back, leaning his large frame across the table to hover over me. Do you think I forgot who co-signed for that first little condo of yours? I put my name on the line for you when you were a nobody. You used the profits from selling that condo to buy this new house. That gives me equitable interest. Legally, I am entitled to a share of that property, and I am choosing to give my share to your sister. So you will sign the paperwork, or we will force the sale and take what is ours. I had to suppress the urge to laugh out loud. His understanding of the law was as outdated as his parenting style. He was banking on my ignorance, hoping that throwing around technical terms like equitable interest would scare me into submission. It was a classic manipulation tactic. I gently placed my glass down and folded my hands on the table. Let me educate you on the reality of my finances since you seem so deeply invested in them. I paid off that condo entirely on my own 3 years before I sold it. Your name was removed from the mortgage the second I refinanced it, which I did without a single dollar of your help. You have absolutely zero legal claim to a single brick of my current house. Deanna tried to interject, her voice trembling with manufactured victimhood. Zuri, why are you being so hateful? We are family. Trayvon and I just need a little help to get started. Why are you hoarding all that space when my baby needs a room? I turned my cold gaze to my brother-in-law. Trayvon sat there, suddenly looking very small inside his oversized, tailored jacket. A little help, I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy air. You want a 6-bedroom mansion in Buckhead for free. That is not a little help, Deanna. That is a hostile takeover. I leaned in, slightly locking eyes with Trayvon. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Let us talk about why you need this house so badly, Trayvon. Because it certainly is not about the baby. If you wanted to provide for your child, maybe you would not be driving a leased Porsche that you are 3 months behind on. Trayvon's face completely drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Oh, did you think I would not know? I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I run a crisis management firm. Information is my currency. I know that the car is leased. I know you have maxed out 4 different credit cards trying to keep up this pathetic facade of being a successful venture capitalist. I know you owe thousands in back taxes. And I know that neither of you has the means to even pay the property taxes on my house, let alone maintain the landscaping. You are lying! Deanna shrieked, entirely breaking her sweet character. She turned to Trayvon, slapping his arm frantically. Tell her she is lying, Trayvon! Tell her! Trayvon swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He avoided her gaze. Now hold on, Zuri, you do not know the whole picture. I have investments tied up right now. Liquidating them would incur massive penalties. Stop talking, Trayvon. I snapped, my voice finally carrying a sharp edge that cut him down instantly. You do not have investments, you have debts. And you, I said, looking back at my parents, are completely out of your minds if you think I am handing over my hard-earned assets to cover for his failures. I have personally paid $247,000 in mortgage payments over the last 24 months. Me. Alone. Not you, Dad. And certainly not Trayvon. I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my sleep, my health, and my peace of mind to build my life. I'm not giving it away to a man who refuses to get a real job. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls in a theatrical display of maternal heartbreak. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head as if looking at a monster. I do not even know who you are anymore, Brenda whispered. Her voice was laced with venom and perfectly calibrated for the audience of surrounding diners who were now openly eavesdropping. You have let money poison your soul, Zuri. You have become a cold, calculating, and arrogant woman. The Bible says that to whom much is given, much will be required. God blessed you with that business, and He expects you to share your blessings with your family. You are a disgrace to the way we raised you, turning your back on your own pregnant sister. turning your back on your blood just to hoard your wealth. She reached over and grabbed Deanna's hand, comforting the 34-year-old woman who was now softly sobbing into a linen napkin. "It is okay, sweetie," my mother cooed, glaring at me. "The Lord will provide for you. We will not let your selfish sister ruin your baby's future." The sheer manipulation of it all was suffocating. For years, I would have crumbled under the weight of her disappointment. In our community, the pressure on successful Black women to carry the financial burdens of their relatives is immense. We are taught to be the mules of the family, expected to sacrifice our own stability to protect broken men and coddled siblings. They relied on my empathy. They weaponized my faith and my desire to be loved, but not tonight. Tonight, the spell was completely broken. I calmly reached into my designer purse and pulled out my wallet. I slid a crisp $100 bill from the leather fold and dropped it squarely in the center of the table. It fluttered down, landing right on top of Deanna's ridiculous Pinterest folder. "That is for my steak," I said, my voice eerily steady. I stood up from the table, smoothing out the front of my blazer. I grabbed my purse and looked down at the four people who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me to fit their narrative. They looked up at me, stunned by my blatant defiance. "You have 30 days to get your things out of the storage unit I have been paying for, Mom. After that, I am canceling the unit." "And Dad," I said, shifting my attention to the man who was still glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "I am looking forward to seeing you try to take my house. I will see you in court. Make sure you can afford the filing fees." I did not wait for a single response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, a steady beat of liberation. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on my back, but I held my head high. As I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air, the valet brought my car around. I handed him his ticket, tipped him generously, and slid into the quiet sanctuary of the driver's seat. For the first time in my life, my chest did not feel tight after an argument with my family. My hands were not shaking. I did not feel the desperate, familiar urge to cry. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of power. They had finally shown me exactly who they were, and I was entirely free of the illusion that I could ever win their love. But as I drove back to my home in Buckhead, watching the city lights blur past the windshield, my mind began to race. My parents were toxic, yes. My father was controlling and my mother was manipulative. But they were not stupid. The desperate aggression at the dinner table felt off. My father's threat to take me to court was completely baseless, and he had to know that. The rush to get me out of my house, the sudden need to hand over a massive asset to Trayvon by the end of the month, it all pointed to something much darker than simple favoritism. They were in a panic. People only panic like that when a clock is ticking. Trayvon's fake watch and leased car were just the tip of the iceberg. I knew I had to dig deeper. I needed to find out exactly what kind of financial hole Trayvon had dug, and why my parents were so desperate to throw me into it to save him. I reached over, tapped the touchscreen on my dashboard, and dialed my lawyer. The line rang twice before Sterling answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a full financial background check on my brother-in-law, and my parents starting first thing in the morning. Sterling did not ask questions. He just told me he would have his investigators on it by dawn. I ended the call, pulled into my driveway, and went to sleep with a strange sense of calm. That calm, however, was violently shattered the moment I woke up. It was 6 in the morning when my phone started vibrating off the nightstand. I reached over, squinting at the bright screen. I had 47 missed calls, over 100 text messages, and a flood of notifications from Facebook and Instagram. My stomach tightened. I sat up in bed, pushing my silk bonnet back, and opened the Facebook app. There it was, right at the top of my feed, a massive multi-paragraph post from my mother. She had tagged 30 different family members and members of her church congregation. Attached to the post was a tragic-looking photo of Deanna rubbing her pregnant belly, looking exhausted and tearful. The caption was a masterclass in manipulation. It read, "Please pray for our family during this devastating season. A mother's heart is completely broken today. We raised our daughters to love one another and share their blessings, but the love of money is the root of all evil." My youngest daughter, who the Lord has blessed with so much abundance, has decided to turn her back on her own blood. She is putting her pregnant sister and her hardworking husband out on the street to protect her own selfish lifestyle. We asked for a small act of grace to help Deanna prepare a safe home for my unborn grandson, but we were met with cruelty and legal threats. Please keep us in your prayers as we try to navigate this profound betrayal. Family is everything, but sadly, not everyone believes that anymore. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. She had flipped the narrative entirely. She did not mention that the small act of grace was demanding I sign over a multi-million-dollar property. She did not mention Trayvon's fake watch or his leased Porsche. She painted herself as a grieving matriarch and Deanna as a helpless victim of my sudden inexplicable greed. The comments section was an absolute dumpster fire of judgment and performative outrage. Aunt Ruby, my mother's oldest sister, had commented, "Lord have mercy. I am so sorry, Brenda. We will pray that God softens Zuri's hardened heart. You do not treat family this way." A deacon from their church wrote, "Success means nothing if you lose your soul. We are here for you, Indiana." I switched over to my text messages. The flying monkeys had been dispatched. My cousin Marcus, who still owed me $5,000 from a failed business venture 2 years ago, had the nerve to text me a lengthy sermon. He wrote, "You need to make this right, Zuri. Your dad is a proud man and you embarrassed him in public. Give your sister the house. You can afford another one. We are supposed to be building generational wealth, not fighting over bricks and mortar. Do not let the devil use you to break this family apart." Then came a voice note from my godmother, Miss Shirley. I pressed play and listened to her disappointed, trembling voice. "Zuri, child, what is going on with you? Your mother called me crying at 2 in the morning. She said you looked her in the eye and told her you did not care if Deanna ended up on the street. That is not the girl I helped raise in Sunday school. Black women need to support their families, not tear them apart. You need to apologize and do the Christian thing." Message after message, the theme was exactly the same. Family first. Protect your blood. They were weaponizing the very culture that was supposed to uplift us, twisting it into a tool for financial abuse. They expected me to shrink myself so Deanna and Trayvon could feel big. In the past, this kind of coordinated emotional attack would have sent me into a tailspin. I would have drafted a dozen apologies trying to explain my side, begging them to understand the financial reality. I would have sacrificed my own sanity just to make the notifications stop and restore the fragile peace. But as I sat there in the quiet luxury of my bedroom, surrounded by the life I had built with my own 2 hands, I felt absolutely nothing but cold resolve. I did not reply to a single text. I did not comment on my mother's post. I did not block them either. I simply turned my phone on. Silent took screenshots of every single message, every public comment, and every guilt-tripping voice note, and forwarded them to a secure folder I shared with Sterling. Let them talk. Let them show their true colors. Their words were no longer weapons that could hurt me. They were evidence of harassment. I got out of bed, walked into my massive marble bathroom, and turned on the shower. As the hot water washed over me, I started analyzing the situation not as a wounded daughter, but as a crisis manager. My agency specialized in handling public relations disasters for high-profile clients. I knew how to read between the lines of a smear campaign, and something about my mother's melodramatic Facebook post was glaringly out of place. My parents were deeply concerned with appearances. They were the kind of people who would hide a foreclosure or a bankruptcy out of sheer pride. Putting our family drama on social media for the entire church and community to see was completely out of character for my mother. She hated public embarrassment more than anything in the world. So why was she willingly broadcasting that Deanna and Trayvon were essentially homeless and begging for my property? The math was not adding up. Entitled people demand things because they think they deserve them. Desperate people demand things because they are out of options. The sheer speed of this escalation, going from a dinner table demand to a full-blown public smear campaign in less than 12 hours, reeked of panic. They were trying to bully me into signing the deed immediately by using the entire extended family as a battering ram. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a thick towel. I walked over to the vanity and looked at my reflection. They needed my house. They did not just want it, they needed it right now. The public nature of this attack was a dead giveaway. My mother was laying the groundwork to justify whatever drastic measure they were planning next. If I was the villain, then anything they did to take the house from me would be seen as righteous justice by the rest of the family. Trayvon was broke. I already knew that. But being broke does not explain why my parents were willing to destroy their relationship with me and humiliate themselves online to secure an asset for him. My father was a stubborn, prideful man. He would never stick his neck out for a deadbeat son-in-law unless he had a massive personal stake in the outcome. My father only protected things that directly affected his own survival or his ego. I walked into my closet and pulled out a sharp, tailored gray pantsuit. I dressed methodically, my mind connecting the dots with chilling precision. If Trayvon owed money, it was not just standard credit card debt. Credit card companies do not make people panic like this. You do not demand a 6-bedroom house to pay off a leased car. You demand a 6-bedroom house because you need hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid equity. A terrifying realization washed over me. What if my parents were tied to Trayvon's debts? What if they had co-signed something for him, just like my father had constantly thrown in my face about my first condo? Deanna was the golden child. If Trayvon had come to them with some fake investment opportunity or a desperate plea for a loan, my parents would have handed over everything they had to protect her. I grabbed my briefcase and my car keys. My phone lit up again with another text, this time from Deanna herself. It read, "I hope you are happy. Mom's blood pressure is through the roof. You are literally destroying this family over pure greed. Just sign the papers and we can all go back to normal." I stared at the text. Go back to normal. Their normal was me serving as the family ATM. Their normal was my submission. I deleted the message without responding. I drove to my office in downtown Atlanta, the morning traffic crawling along the interstate. I spent the entire drive formulating a strategy. I needed to let them think they were winning the public relations battle. Let them rally the aunts, the uncles, and the church choir. Let them paint me as the villain. In crisis management, you never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. You let them overplay their hand. By the time I walked into my agency, my assistant handed me a fresh cup of coffee and a thick manila envelope that had just been couriered over from Sterling's office. The label on the front simply read, "Preliminary Findings." I walked into my private office, locked the door, and sat down at my desk. The smear campaign was just noise. The real war was hidden inside this envelope. I took a deep breath, broke the seal, and pulled out the stack of financial documents. It was time to find out exactly how deep the rot in my family truly went. I spent Monday evening piecing together the initial documents Sterling sent over. The financial rot was worse than I had imagined, but I needed Sterling to verify the corporate structures before I made my next move. I decided to work from home on Tuesday morning to review the files in peace. It was just past 9. The Atlanta sun was already baking the pavement outside. I was standing in my kitchen wearing comfortable silk loungewear, pouring myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. My house was completely silent, a sanctuary of my own making. Then the heavy grating rumble of a diesel engine shattered the quiet. I walked over to the large bay window in my living room and pulled back the sheer curtain. A massive white box truck was backing into my pristine driveway, its tires crushing the edge of my freshly manicured lawn. Two men in matching moving company t-shirts hopped out of the cab. A moment later, the passenger door of a silver sedan parked behind the truck swung open. Out stepped Trayvon. He was wearing a ridiculous designer tracksuit that probably cost more than his monthly car payment, completely inappropriate for moving day but perfect for projecting an image of wealth he did not possess. I watched in absolute disbelief as he stood on my lawn, clapping his hands together and pointing toward my front porch. The movers rolled up the back door of the truck and began unloading boxes. Then came the furniture: a white wooden crib, a pink changing table, a rocking chair. They were piling Deanna's nursery furniture right onto my front lawn. The sheer audacity of the scene playing out in front of me was almost cinematic. They had not won a court case. I had not signed a single document. Yet here was Trayvon acting on pure weaponized entitlement, genuinely believing he could just arrive at my property and claim it by force. This was the result of a lifetime of my parents enabling bad behavior. Deanna and Trayvon had never been told no, and they had convinced themselves that my refusal at the restaurant was just a temporary tantrum they could steamroll over. Trayvon marched up the stone steps to my heavy oak front door. I stood in the foyer less than 3 feet away on the other side of the solid wood sipping my coffee. I heard the metallic scrape of a key sliding into the deadbolt. Trayvon tried to turn it. The lock did not budge. He jiggled it aggressively. He pulled it out, pushed it back in, and forced it with all his weight. Nothing happened. I had changed the locks the very morning after I closed on the house. My mother had thrown a massive fit back then, demanding a spare key for emergencies. I knew her version of an emergency meant dropping by unannounced to inspect my cleaning habits or snoop through my mail. I handed her a shiny new key to appease her, knowing full well it went to the back door of my old apartment, not this house. It seemed she had finally passed that useless piece of metal onto Trayvon. When the key failed, the pounding started. Trayvon slammed his fist against the heavy oak. "Zuri, open this door. I know you are in there." His voice was muffled but loud, echoing through the quiet, upscale neighborhood. "Open up. Your mother gave us the key. We are moving in today. Deanna is waiting in the car at Mom's house, and I need to get this nursery set up. Stop playing games and open the door." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue. Arguing with a narcissist who is performing for an audience is a waste of oxygen. Trayvon needed to prove to my sister and my parents that he was a man capable of providing a home even if he had to steal it from me to do so. He was putting on a show of dominance. I was not going to participate in his play. He kicked the bottom of the door. The heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. "Come on, Zuri. We have a lease ending. You are being completely ridiculous. This is family property. Open the damn door before I have to break it down." That was all I needed to hear. A direct threat of forced entry. I calmly walked over to the marble kitchen island, set my coffee mug down, and picked up my phone. I dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was sharp and professional. "Yes, I am reporting an active home invasion and trespassing at my residence." I gave her my address in Buckhead. "I am inside my home alone. There is an aggressive man pounding on my front door, attempting to break in. He just threatened to kick the door down. He has a moving truck parked in my driveway and is illegally dumping furniture on my lawn. Do you know the individual, ma'am? He is my brother-in-law, but he has no legal right to be here, no ownership of the property, and I have explicitly told him he is not welcome. He is acting erratically and trying to force entry." "I understand. Units are being dispatched right now. Are you in a safe location?" "I am perfectly safe," I replied, my voice completely devoid of panic. "The doors are reinforced. Just send the officers quickly before he damages the property." I hung up the phone. I walked back to the window and watched. Trayvon had given up on the front door and was now pacing angrily across the lawn, yelling into his cell phone. He was likely complaining to my mother or Deanna that I was being stubborn. The movers were standing off to the side, looking incredibly uncomfortable. They were professionals, and they clearly sensed that something about this job was deeply wrong. One of them pulled out a clipboard and tried to hand it to Trayvon, probably asking for a signature to just drop the items and leave, but Trayvon waved him off angrily. 5 minutes later, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning air. 2 Atlanta Police Department cruisers turned sharply onto my street, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly in the sunlight. They pulled up right behind the massive moving truck, blocking it from leaving. This was the moment Trayvon could have saved himself. A smart man, or even a mildly rational one, would have realized he was trespassing and immediately tried to de-escalate. But Trayvon was fueled by the toxic entitlement my family had pumped into him. He genuinely believed that because my mother said he could have the house, the law would simply agree with him. Instead of looking worried, Trayvon puffed out his chest and walked confidently toward the 2 uniformed officers who were stepping out of their vehicles. "It is about time you guys got here," Trayvon called out, waving his hand toward my house. My crazy sister-in-law has locked herself inside and will not let the movers in. Tell her to open the door. We have a lot of heavy lifting to do today." The officers did not look amused. They had their hands resting near their duty belts, instantly assessing the situation. The older officer, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Sir, step back from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them. Who are you and what is your business at this residence?" Trevon scoffed, looking offended that he was being questioned instead of obeyed. "I am Trevon. This is my family's house. Well, it is my house now. My mother-in-law gave it to us for the new baby. We are moving in. The girl inside is just throwing a temper tantrum. Go knock on the door and tell her to let us in." The younger officer walked over to the movers, quietly asking them questions, while the older officer focused entirely on Trevon. "Do you have a deed to this property, sir? A lease agreement. Any piece of legal documentation with your name on it connecting you to this address?" Trevon rolled his eyes, his frustration boiling over. "I do not need a piece of paper. It is a family arrangement. Look, I have the key right here." He reached aggressively into his pocket. Both officers instantly tensed. "Do not reach into your pockets. Keep your hands visible right now." The older officer barked the command, his voice echoing loudly across the lawn. Trevon pulled his hand out, holding the useless spare key my mother had given him. He held it up like a trophy. "See, I have the key. Now go do your jobs and get her out of my house." The older officer was completely unbothered by the performance. "Sir, we received a call from the legal homeowner stating that you are trespassing and attempting to break down the door. If you do not have proof of ownership, you need to instruct these movers to pack this furniture back up, and you need to vacate the premises immediately. If you do not leave, you will be arrested for trespassing." Trevon's face contorted with rage. The facade of the wealthy, connected investor completely crumbled, revealing the desperate, entitled scammer underneath. "You are not arresting me. You work for me. I pay your salary. You do not know who I am. You cannot kick me off my own property. My mother-in-law said this is my house. Sir, this is your final warning. Leave the property now. I am not going anywhere." Trevon stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the officer, pointing his finger aggressively right into the cop's face. "You are going to go up to that door, and you are going to make that selfish witch let me in." That was the fatal mistake. You do not aggressively close the distance on an Atlanta police officer while aggressively pointing in their face and refusing a direct lawful order to leave a property you do not own. It happened incredibly fast. The older officer grabbed Trevon's outstretched arm, twisting it sharply behind his back. Trevon yelped in pain and surprise, completely losing his balance. The younger officer stepped in instantly. Together, they spun Trevon around and slammed him face first against the hood of the black and white cruiser. "Hey, get off me! What are you doing?" Trevon screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. He started thrashing, trying to pull his arms free, which only made things worse. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting right now!" The officer yelled, pressing his forearm firmly against Trevon's upper back to hold him down against the hot metal of the car hood. "You are breaking my arm. Do you know who I am? I will sue you. I will sue this whole city." Trevon wailed, completely humiliated, as the movers stood by, watching the man who hired them get taken down. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed sharply. They secured his wrists tightly behind his back. The officers pulled him up off the hood, his expensive designer tracksuit now smeared with dirt and car wax. His face was red, sweating profusely, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Trevon, you are under arrest for criminal trespassing and resisting an officer without violence. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The officer read him his rights seamlessly, while patting down his pockets, pulling out his wallet and the useless key. I unlocked my front door and stepped out onto the porch. I had my arms crossed over my chest, watching the entire scene with an expression of absolute indifference. The older officer looked up and saw me. "Ma'am, are you the homeowner?" "Yes, officer," I replied clearly. "My name is Zuri. I am the sole owner of this property." Trevon twisted his head around to look at me, his eyes burning with absolute hatred. "Zuri, tell them Mom gave us the house. Tell them to take these cuffs off me right now. Deanna is pregnant. You are stressing out the baby. Tell them. I looked right through him. I turned my attention back to the officer. I want to press full charges for the trespassing. He threatened to kick my door down. I also want him formally trespassed from this property so that if he ever sets foot on my grass again, it is an immediate felony. Understood, ma'am, the officer said respectfully. He looked over at the movers. Pack this stuff back into your truck and get off this lady's property. If you leave anything behind, I will cite you for illegal dumping. The movers did not need to be told twice. They practically sprinted to the lawn, tossing the crib and the boxes carelessly into the back of the truck, desperate to escape the disaster they had been dragged into. Trayvon was pushed into the back of the police cruiser. The heavy door slammed shut, trapping him behind the metal cage. I stood on my porch and watched as the police car backed out of my driveway, taking my arrogant brother-in-law straight to the county jail. The moving truck scrambled out right behind them. In less than 20 minutes, my front yard was empty and silent again. The only evidence that Trayvon had ever been there were the tire tracks cutting through the edge of my lawn. I turned around, walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home, and locked the heavy oak door. I picked up my coffee mug from the kitchen island. It was still warm. I took a sip, pulled out my phone, and realized that my family was about to lose their collective minds. Less than 2 minutes passed before my phone screen lit up. The caller ID flashed Deanna's name. I placed my coffee mug on the counter, took a deep breath, and swiped to answer. I did not even get a chance to say hello before the hysterical screaming started. Zuri, what did you just do? What is wrong with you? Deanna wailed. Her voice was shrill and frantic, echoing loudly through my quiet kitchen. I just watched them put Trayvon in the back of a police car. How could you call the cops on your own brother-in-law? He was just trying to move our things. I let her scream for a few seconds, resting my hands flat on the cool marble. You mean he was trying to break into my house, Deanna? I corrected her, my tone completely flat. He brought a moving truck to a house he does not own, tried to force his way through my front door, and then threatened an Atlanta police officer. I did not arrest him. His own arrogant stupidity arrested him. You set him up. Deanna sobbed, her breathing heavy. You knew Mom gave us the key and you purposely changed the locks to humiliate him. Do you know what this kind of stress does to a pregnant woman? I am literally shaking in the car down the street. If something happens to my baby because of the stress you are causing me today, it will be entirely your fault. You are a cold-hearted monster. The manipulation was textbook. Whenever Deanna faced a consequence, she weaponized her condition to become the victim. I was not buying it. Nobody forced Trayvon to come here, I replied calmly. Nobody forced him to act like a thug in front of law enforcement. You and Mom fed his delusion that he could just take my property. Now he is facing the reality of the law. You need to call the precinct right now and drop the charges. Deanna demanded, her tears turning into anger. Tell them he had permission to be there. I am not dropping anything, I said, my voice hardening. He is formally trespassed. You better find a good bondsman, Deanna, because he is going to be sitting in a holding cell for a while. Before she could scream again, I ended the call. The silence wrapped around me, but almost instantly my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my father. I pressed play and Desmond's booming, furious voice filled the room. Zuri, you have crossed the line for the last time. He barked, his voice vibrating with absolute rage. You had her husband arrested over a simple family misunderstanding. You think because you have money, you can treat us like garbage. Let me make something very clear to you. You are going to call the police and get him out right now. And if you do not, I promise you, I will make it my mission to tear down everything you have built. I know exactly who your clients are. I will call every single one of them and tell them what kind of ruthless, selfish person you are. I will ruin your reputation in this city. Call the precinct. Now. The voicemail ended. A year ago, a threat like that would have sent me into a panic. The idea of him calling my corporate clients to smear my name would have terrified me. But today, it sounded like a desperate man grasping at straws. My clients were Fortune 500 executives. If an angry man called their offices ranting about a family dispute, my clients would just hang up. His threat was hollow. I walked into my home office, sat at my glass desk, and began to process the logistics. While my family threw tantrums, my mind pivoted to the cold facts. Something was glaringly wrong. Trayvon was arrested for criminal trespassing and resisting an officer without violence. These were misdemeanor charges. In Fulton County, the standard bail would be around $1,500 to $2,000. Through a bondsman, Trayvon only needed 10%. He needed maybe $200 to walk out of that jail cell. Deanna had just panicked, begging me to drop the charges so he could come home. My father was leaving extortionist voicemails to get him released. Why fight so hard to get me to drop the charges immediately? The answer hit me like a physical blow, because they did not have the money to bail him out. Trayvon wore designer tracksuits and boasted about his massive venture capital investments. Deanna acted like a wealthy wife. Yet when faced with a petty bail amount that any working adult could cover, the entire family was in a meltdown. Trayvon could not post a mere $1,500 bail. His accounts must be drained. Even more revealing, my parents could not bail him out either. Desmond and Brenda, who always bragged about their pristine credit scores, apparently did not have a few $100s in liquid cash to rescue Trayvon. The facade was cracking wide open. The wealth was a total illusion. The desperation to seize my house was not just about getting Deanna a nice nursery. It was a matter of financial life and death. They were broke, buried under debt, and my house was the only life raft left. They needed my equity to survive whatever financial disaster Trayvon had caused. It was time to go on the offensive. I picked up my phone and dialed Sterling Pierce. Sterling was a ruthless top-tier corporate litigator. He specialized in destroying financial fraudsters. He did not argue with emotion. He argued with bank statements and wire transfers. He was a predator, and I needed a predator. The line rang once before his sharp voice answered. "Zuri, tell me you have good news." "I have a complete circus, Sterling," I replied. "But I think we just found the weak spot in the tent." I gave him a rapid rundown of the morning. I told him about the moving truck, the confrontation, Trayvon getting arrested, Deanna's hysterical call, and my father's voicemail. Then I laid out my theory. Sterling Trayvon is sitting in jail over a trespassing charge. They are begging me to drop it because nobody in that family can afford a $200 bond. This man claims to be an investor. My parents claim to have a flawless portfolio. It is all a lie. They are completely underwater. I could hear his pen clicking rapidly. "You are absolutely right," Zuri Sterling said smoothly. "People with money do not stage home invasions. They hire lawyers. The fact that he showed up with a moving truck means they are out of time. They needed physical possession of your property today." "Why today?" I asked. "Because someone is likely breathing down their necks," Sterling replied. "If Trayvon owes money to the wrong people, or if he defaulted on a massive loan, they might be facing immediate asset seizure. They needed your house so they could leverage it. They were probably planning to take out a massive line of credit against your equity the second the deed was transferred." A cold chill ran down my spine. They were going to steal my house and immediately put it into debt to save him. "Sterling," I said, my voice hardening into steel, "authorize your private investigators to dig into everything. I do not care the cost. I want Trayvon's bank records. I want his tax returns. I want the registration for his car. I want every LLC he has ever registered. And pull my parents' financial records too. Check their mortgage, check their credit lines. I want to know exactly what they are hiding." "Consider it done," Sterling said. "I have a contact at the clerk's office. I will pull the arrest report and run a deep background check on his associates. If he is hiding money or hiding debt, I will find it by tomorrow. Do not hold back, Sterling. They just declared war on me. I want to make sure they do not have a single weapon left." I hung up the phone and looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. The little girl who cried for her parents' approval was gone. In her place was a woman ready to dismantle her family's fake empire brick by lying brick. Let Trayvon sit in jail. Let Deanna cry. Let my father scream. They picked a fight with the wrong daughter, and I was going to finish it. I stood up and walked over to the large bay window, looking out at the tire tracks Traven's moving truck had left on my grass. They were a permanent reminder of how far my family was willing to go to violate my boundaries. The audacity to think they could just bulldoze their way into my life and claim the fruits of my labor was astounding. But what was even more astounding was their sheer incompetence. They had underestimated me at every single turn. They thought my success was just luck. They thought my silence at family dinners over the years meant I was weak. They did not understand that while they were busy playing dress-up and pretending to be a wealthy, successful family, I was actually in the trenches doing the grueling work to build real wealth. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. I had a public relations agency to run, clients to manage, and a life to live. I was not going to let their self-inflicted crisis derail my day. Traven could enjoy the accommodations at the Fulton County Jail. It would be a stark contrast to the 6-bedroom mansion he had planned on stealing. As for my parents, they were about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson about the true cost of blind loyalty. I opened my email and began drafting responses to my team. The battle lines were officially drawn, and I had the best legal mind in Atlanta loading the ammunition. Tomorrow, Sterling would hand me the keys to their destruction, and I would not hesitate to use them. Wednesday morning arrived with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. I bypassed my usual morning routine, trading my comfortable home office attire for a charcoal gray tailored suit that felt more like armor. The drive to downtown Atlanta was a blur of traffic and towering glass high-rises reflecting the harsh morning sun. I pulled my car into the subterranean parking garage of the Pearson Associates building, a sleek monolith of corporate power that dominated the city skyline. This was not a place for family disputes or emotional mediation. This was where multi-million-dollar empires were dismantled and corporate raiders were put to the sword. I stepped off the private elevator onto the 40th floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble and brushed steel. Sterling Pierce was already waiting for me in his corner office. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a sweeping view of the city I had conquered. Sterling was a man who looked exactly like the hourly rate he charged. He was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a navy pinstripe suit with sharp features and cold, calculating gray eyes. We had worked together twice before when my public relations firm needed aggressive litigation to protect high-net-worth clients from blackmail. He knew my temperament, and I knew his methods. There was a reason he did not offer me a cup of tea or ask about my emotional well-being when I walked in. He did not see a grieving daughter betrayed by her flesh and blood. He saw a chief executive officer dealing with a massive liability. I took a seat in the leather chair opposite his massive mahogany desk. He appreciated that I did not waste time crying or seeking validation. In our previous dealings, Sterling had noted that I operated with a chilling level of detachment when under fire. We both understood the fundamental truth of the situation playing out with my parents. This was not a family drama. This was a hostile corporate takeover. They were attempting to acquire my primary physical asset through coercion and fraudulent claims of equity. They were using emotional blackmail the way a corrupt board of directors might use a smear campaign. Therefore, I was going to handle them the exact same way I would handle a rogue competitor trying to ruin my business. I do not want to just build a defensive wall, Sterling, I said, setting my briefcase on the floor. I want to go on the absolute offensive. If they are willing to orchestrate a home invasion to secure a piece of real estate, they are desperate. Desperate people make sloppy financial mistakes. I want to find every single mistake Trevon and my parents have made over the last decade. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a rare, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I agree entirely, Zuri. Playing defense only invites them to keep trying. If we want them to retreat permanently, we have to show them that stepping onto your battlefield will cost them everything they have left. He picked up a thick tablet from his desk and tapped the screen. I had my team work through the night based on the preliminary data we discussed. Trayvon is still sitting in a holding cell, by the way. No one has come to post the $200 bond. That confirms my theory, I replied, crossing my legs. They are entirely illiquid. What else have you found? Sterling leaned forward, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a list of names and business entities. I have officially dispatched 3 of our top private investigators. They are currently pulling every shred of financial history connected to Trayvon, Deanna Desmond, and Brenda. We are not just looking at credit scores. I have them pulling tax returns, limited liability company, filings, offshore banking inquiries, and property deed histories. They are running deep asset tracing through databases that normal citizens do not even know exist. I scanned the list. I see 3 different company names listed under Trayvon. Shell companies, Sterling confirmed, all registered in the state of Delaware to obscure ownership, but my investigators pierced the corporate veil by cross-referencing the registered agent addresses and tax identification numbers. Trayvon has been operating under the guise of a venture capital firm called Apex Holdings. It is a ghost ship. There are no actual investments, no payroll, and no legitimate revenue streams. Just a series of commercial loans moving money back and forth to create the illusion of cash flow to anyone not looking closely. I tapped my fingernail against the glass desk, processing the raw data. A Ponzi scheme. A very low-rent version of one, yes, Sterling replied. But here is where it gets incredibly problematic for your brother-in-law. The initial funds he used to lease that Porsche and rent his luxury office space did not come from actual investors. They came from a massive commercial loan. We are still waiting for the exact figures from the bank, but my forensic accountants flagged a massive default notice issued to Apex Holdings 2 weeks ago. Trayvon is underwater, and whoever he borrowed that money from is calling the debt. That is why he showed up at your house with a moving truck. I stared out the window, watching the tiny cars move along the highway far below. They needed my house so Trayvon could leverage the equity. He would have taken out a massive second mortgage the second my name was off the deed. He was going to use my property as a sacrificial lamb to pay off his creditors. Exactly, Sterling said. But the missing piece is your parents. Why would Desmond and Brenda risk their own reputations and alienate their most successful child for a son-in-law who is clearly running a financial scam? Why orchestrate a public smear campaign on social media for a man sitting in a county jail cell over a trespassing charge? That is the most disturbing part of this entire equation, I said, turning my attention back to the high-powered lawyer. My father is an incredibly arrogant man, but he is fiercely protective of his own assets. He would never stick his neck out for Trayvon unless his own neck was already on the chopping block. He loves his golden child, Deanna, but he loves his own financial comfort more. You need to dig into my parents' finances with the exact same level of aggression. Sterling nodded, making a swift note on his tablet. I have my team pulling the mortgage history on your parents' suburban house as we speak. If they co-signed a loan for Trayvon, or if they pledged their own property as collateral for his business debts, we will find the paper trail. We are pulling their retirement account statements, their credit card histories, and any recent bank transfers exceeding $10,000. We are also running their names through federal civil dockets to see if any secondary lenders have initiated litigation against them. If there is a financial link between Desmond and Trayvon, I will have it sitting on this desk by tomorrow morning. What do we do in the meantime? I asked, leaning forward to inspect a secondary document outlining Trayvon's defunct tax filings. My father specifically threatened to take me to court at the dinner table. Will he actually file a lawsuit against me? Sterling laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the glass walls. He will certainly try. He will likely hire some bottom-feeding attorney who works out of a strip mall to draft a frivolous summons. They will try to claim equitable interest or a verbal contract to scare you into a rapid settlement. It is a very common shakedown tactic used by desperate people hoping the victim is afraid of a lengthy legal battle. When they do send that paperwork, we are not going to throw it out immediately. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued by his tactical pivot. We are going to entertain a frivolous lawsuit from a desperate man. We are going to do much more than entertain it, Zuri. We are going to use it as a trap. Sterling steepled his fingers together, his eyes narrowing. Let them officially file their ridiculous claims. Let them go on the record demanding your property. Once they commit to a legal proceeding, they open themselves up to the brutal reality of the discovery process. We will have the legal authority to subpoena every single document they are trying to hide. We can force them to produce their bank statements under the penalty of perjury. I felt a cold thrill run through my veins. It was the perfect strategy. My family thought they were playing a game of emotional intimidation. They thought they could bully me into compliance because they always had in the past. They had absolutely no idea they were stepping into the crosshairs of a massive financial investigation. I wanted them to feel confident. I wanted them to think they had me cornered, because the higher they climbed on their pedestal of false righteousness, the more devastating their inevitable fall would be. "Do whatever it takes." "Sterling," I said, my voice completely resolute. "Spare absolutely no expense on the private investigators. I want every bank statement, every wire transfer, and every defaulted loan agreement neatly organized in a binder. When I finally sit down to confront them, I do not want to have an argument. I want to execute an absolute massacre of their false reality." Sterling closed his tablet and offered a sharp nod of approval. "You will have your weapons by tomorrow afternoon, Zuri. In the meantime, you must ignore their phone calls. Let them panic. Let them scramble to find bail money for Trayvon. Your utter silence will be far more terrifying to them than any legal threat you could make." I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my suit jacket. We shook hands, a firm clinical agreement between two professionals preparing for corporate warfare. I walked out of his office, the heavy glass door sealing shut behind me. As I rode the private elevator back down to the parking garage, I checked my phone. There were 12 new voicemails from Deanna, alternating between furious screaming and pathetic begging. There were 4 more texts from my mother quoting scripture about forgiveness and the virtue of sharing wealth. They were completely oblivious to the hurricane that was currently gathering off their coast. They still thought they were dealing with the little girl who always compromised her own safety to keep the peace. They were wrong. That girl died the moment they demanded the keys to my house. I got into my car and drove back to my agency, ready to let Sterling destroy their empire. The rest of my Wednesday passed in a state of hyper-focused productivity. While my phone continued to light up with furious text messages from aunts and uncles who had no idea they were defending a criminal, I sat in my corner office and directed my public relations team through 3 separate corporate crises. Handling actual high-stakes emergencies made my family's manufactured drama feel incredibly small. I slept soundly that night, entirely unbothered by the fact that my brother-in-law was currently sleeping on a metal cot in a county jail cell. Thursday morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze. I was at my desk by 8 reviewing a press release when my private line rang. It was Sterling. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply told me to cancel my morning meetings and get down to his office immediately. The tone of his voice sent a sharp thrill of anticipation straight through my chest. It was the distinct sound of a predator that had just caught the scent of blood. I arrived at Pearson Associates 30 minutes later, bypassing the receptionist and walking straight back to Sterling's private boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors were already propped open. Sterling was standing at the head of a massive conference table. Next to him stood a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and a thick stack of manila folders tucked under his arm. The entire back wall of the boardroom, which was usually a blank white projection screen, was covered in printed bank statements, highlighted limited liability company filings, and a complex web of financial transfers drawn out in red dry erase marker. It looked less like a corporate law office and more like a Federal Bureau of Investigation war room. "Zuri, come in and shut the door," Sterling said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory sharpness. "I want to introduce you to David. He is my lead forensic accountant." David has not slept in 24 hours, but what he found buried in the Delaware corporate registry is going to give you everything you need to end this ridiculous charade. I closed the heavy doors, instantly muting the hum of the law firm outside. I took a seat at the center of the long table, resting my hands on the cool, polished wood. "Show me," I said simply. David stepped forward, spreading 3 thick folders across the table directly in front of me. "Your instincts were absolutely flawless, Ms. Zuri." David began, his voice raspy from exhaustion. "Trayvon is not a venture capitalist. He has never facilitated a single legitimate investment in his entire life. The company he constantly brags about, Apex Holdings, has 0 clients and generates 0 organic revenue. It is nothing more than a hollow shell company that he registered using a virtual office address." "Then how is he paying for his life?" I asked, tracing my finger over the edge of the top folder. "The Porsche. The designer clothes, the luxury vacations Deanna is always posting on Instagram. Sterling leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table. He is paying for it with stolen money, Zuri. 7 months ago, Trayvon applied for a massive commercial loan through a private high-yield lending syndicate based out of Chicago. These are not standard bank loans. They are aggressive alternative lenders that deal in high-risk capital. Trayvon submitted a comprehensive loan application, claiming that Apex Holdings was expanding its real estate portfolio. David opened the first folder, revealing a stack of heavily highlighted documents. To secure the loan, Trayvon falsified his entire financial history. He fabricated 3 years of corporate tax returns. He forged profit and loss statements. He even created fake bank letters of credit to make it look like Apex Holdings had over $1 million in liquid cash reserves. It was a completely fraudulent application from top to bottom. But because the documents looked incredibly convincing, and because he paid a shady broker to push the paperwork through the syndicate, approved the funding, I felt the air in the room shift. A cold, hard reality began to settle over me. How much did they give him? $470,000, Sterling stated, enunciating every single syllable for maximum impact. They wired $470,000 directly into Trayvon's business account. I stared at the number written in bold red ink on the whiteboard. $470,000. It was a staggering amount of money to hand to a man who possessed absolutely zero business acumen. And where did it all go? I asked, looking between Sterling and David. Because I know for a fact he did not buy any real estate. David flipped open the second folder. This is where Trayvon's profound stupidity truly shines. He genuinely believed he was a financial genius. The moment the loan cleared, he transferred $200,000 into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. He bought into a series of highly volatile, obscure crypto tokens, likely hoping to double the money overnight, pay back the loan, and pocket the difference. Let me guess, I said, a bitter smirk, pulling at the corner of my mouth. The crypto market crashed. It did not just crash. David corrected. The specific exchange he used was exposed as a massive rug pull scam. The founders drained the liquidity pools and vanished. Trayvon lost that entire $200,000 in a matter of 48 hours. It evaporated completely. I shook my head in sheer disbelief. He gambled $500,000 of borrowed money on internet coins. What about the rest of the funds? Sterling stepped in, his expression turning entirely grim. The remaining $270,000 went directly toward funding the illusion of his success. Trayvon used the corporate account like a personal piggy bank. He paid the massive upfront lease deposit on the Porsche. He rented luxury penthouses on Airbnb for weekend trips just so Deanna could take pictures and pretend they owned the properties. He bought fake Rolex watches, expensive jewelry, and paid for VIP tables at nightclubs in Atlanta to network with other so-called investors. He burned through the remaining capital in less than 6 months just to convince your family and the internet that he was a wealthy man. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the deception. Deanna had always been obsessed with appearances. She wanted to be a rich stay-at-home mother with a powerful husband. Trayvon knew he could never actually provide that life, so he simply stole the money to buy the props. He bought the car, the clothes, and the vacations, knowing the entire time that a ticking time bomb was strapped to his chest. And now the bomb has detonated, I concluded softly. The loan is in default. Sterling nodded sharply. He missed his first major balloon payment last month. When he missed the second payment 2 weeks ago, the lending syndicate initiated an audit. That is when they realized the tax returns he submitted were completely fabricated. David pulled out a single sheet of paper from the final folder and slid it across the mahogany table toward me. It was a formal demand letter printed on heavy, intimidating legal letterhead. The syndicate is furious, David explained. They are not just demanding their money back. They have formally notified Trayvon that if the $470,000 balance plus penalties and interest is not paid in full by the end of this month, they are turning his entire file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The FBI. We were no longer talking about a civil dispute or a bad business deal. We were talking about criminal prosecution. Falsifying documents to secure a loan across state lines is federal wire fraud. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a serious lethal register. It carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Trayvon is not just broke, Zuri. He is staring down the barrel of a massive federal indictment. The syndicate does not want to go to the authorities because they want their money back, but they will absolutely pull the trigger if he does not pay. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with violent clarity. The dinner at the steakhouse. My mother's sudden aggressive demand that I sign over my 6-bedroom house. My father's desperate threats. The moving truck showing up at my property. The frantic social media smear campaign designed to bully me into submission. It all made perfect sense now. They needed my house, I whispered, staring blindly at the whiteboard. They were going to force me to sign the deed over to Deanna. Once the house was in her name, Trayvon was going to use my property as collateral to take out a massive emergency loan to pay off the syndicate. Exactly, Sterling confirmed. Your house in Buckhead is easily worth over $1 million, and because you paid off so much of your mortgage, you have massive equity. You were the bailout plan. They were going to drain the equity out of your home to save Trayvon from federal prison. A wave of profound disgust washed over me, thick and suffocating. My own parents were willing to steal my home, ruin my financial future, and throw me out on the street just to cover up a federal crime committed by their golden child's husband. They did not care about my sacrifices. They did not care about the 80-hour work weeks I endured. They viewed my success entirely as an emergency fund to fix Deanna's mistakes. I looked up at Sterling, the last remnants of my familial guilt completely incinerated. The shock was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. My father threatened to ruin my reputation yesterday, I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. He left a voicemail threatening to call my clients if I did not bail Trayvon out of his trespassing charge. He actually thought he had the high ground. Sterling walked over to the whiteboard and capped the red marker. He only thinks he has the high ground because he assumes you are still the little girl who will eventually cave to his demands. He has absolutely no idea that we are holding his son-in-law's federal wire fraud file in our hands. There was only one piece of the puzzle left that did not fit. Trayvon was a scammer, yes, but my parents were incredibly selfish people. Why would they go to such extreme lengths risking their own relationship with me to save Trayvon? They could have simply let him go to prison and welcomed Deanna back home. There had to be a reason my father was panicking with such intense personal aggression. Sterling, I said, looking directly into the lawyer's cold gray eyes. Trayvon is going down. But my father would never orchestrate a hostile takeover of my house just to save a son-in-law he secretly looks down on. My father only protects his own money. Trayvon must have dragged them into this. Did you check my parents' financial records? Did they co-sign that fraudulent loan? Sterling's expression shifted, a dark, heavy shadow falling over his features. He looked at David, who silently closed the folders on the table and took a step back. Zuri, Sterling said quietly, what Trayvon did was reckless and criminal, but what your father did is going to leave your entire family completely destitute. We pulled the title history on your parents' house this morning. The situation is much, much worse than you can possibly imagine. I braced myself against the edge of the mahogany table, the cool wood grounding me as Sterling pulled a separate, much thicker file from his briefcase. He placed it directly over the documents detailing Trayvon's wire fraud. This file did not have Trayvon's name on it. It had my father's name, Desmond, printed in stark black letters across the tab. David stepped forward again, opening the folder to reveal a stack of legal contracts heavily stamped with notary seals and bank letterheads. What did he do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My father has owned his house in the suburbs free and clear for 10 years. He paid off the mortgage right after I graduated high school. He always bragged about having the deed locked in a fireproof safe. He did have the deed, Sterling said, his tone devoid of any sympathy, delivering the facts with lethal precision. Until 4 months ago. 4 months ago, Trayvon received his first default notice from the lending syndicate. He panicked. He knew he was facing federal wire fraud charges, and he knew he had no way to pay back the $470,000. So he went to the one person who would do absolutely anything to protect Deanna from a public scandal. He went to your father. I stared at the documents, the dense legal jargon blurring together. You are telling me my father knew about the fraud. He knew Trayvon stole $500,000 and blew it on fake cryptocurrency and luxury rentals, and he kept it a secret. He did more than keep it a secret. Zuri David interjected, pointing to a specific clause on the second page of the contract. He actively participated in covering it up. When Trayvon went to your father, the syndicate was preparing to file the paperwork with the federal authorities. Your father intervened. He contacted the syndicate's attorneys and negotiated a forbearance agreement. A forbearance is a temporary pause on the collection of a debt. But high-risk syndicates do not just grant forbearance out of the kindness of their hearts. They require a massive showing of good faith. They require collateral. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. My father does not have $500,000 in liquid cash. No, he does not. Sterling agreed. But he did have a suburban home, valued at roughly $600,000, with absolutely zero debt attached to it. Your father signed a cross-collateralization agreement. He pledged his fully paid home as the physical collateral to secure the forbearance on Trayvon's fraudulent commercial loan. He tied his own financial survival directly to a sinking ship, all to ensure that Deanna would not have to suffer the embarrassment of her husband going to federal prison. The sheer magnitude of the stupidity was staggering. My father, a man who had spent his entire life lecturing me about financial responsibility, a man who threw his meager contribution to my first condo in my face for years, had risked his entire life savings on a known scammer. He had handed over the deed to his house to a predatory lending syndicate to protect the illusion of his golden child's perfect marriage. So what happened? I asked, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. A forbearance is just a pause. It is not a pardon. Exactly, Sterling said. The forbearance gave Trayvon 90 days to liquidate assets and come up with the $470,000. Your father likely believed Trayvon's lies about having money tied up in investments that just needed time to mature. He probably thought putting the house up as collateral was merely a formality, a temporary measure to keep the wolves at bay while Trayvon gathered the funds. But there were no funds. Trayvon had nothing. The 90 days expired 2 weeks ago. Trayvon missed the deadline. David pulled out the final piece of paper from the file. It was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose. The syndicate is not playing games, Ms. Zuri. They are calling the debt. Because your father signed that cross-collateralization agreement, Trayvon's default is now legally your father's default. The syndicate has initiated foreclosure proceedings on your parents' house. If they do not produce $470,000 by the 1st of next month, the bank will seize the property. Your parents will be evicted, and the house will be auctioned off to satisfy Trayvon's debt. The 1st of next month. The words echoed in my mind like a death knell. That was less than 3 weeks away. The timeline clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The rushed dinner at the steakhouse, the desperate, violent demand for my signature on the quitclaim deed, the moving truck showing up at my front door. It was not just about getting Deanna a nice nursery for the baby. It was a desperate, coordinated attack to steal my equity to save themselves from homelessness. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly up at the recessed lighting of the boardroom ceiling. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of the betrayal. I walked back through the entire sequence of events in my mind, replacing the narrative of an entitled sister with the reality of a desperate, drowning family. They needed my house, I whispered, the full horror of their plan finally taking shape. They were going to force me out and put the deed in Deanna's name. Yes, Sterling confirmed, his voice hard and uncompromising. Because Deanna has clean credit. Trayvon's credit is ruined, and your parents' credit is currently tied up in the foreclosure. Deanna is the only one left with a clean financial slate. Once your multi-million-dollar house was legally transferred into her name, she could instantly qualify for a massive cash-out refinance or a high-yield equity line of credit. They were going to drain my equity, I said, my voice shaking not from sadness, but from a profound, white-hot rage. They were going to pull $500,000 in debt against my property to pay off the syndicate. They were going to use my house to save their house, and they were going to leave me with absolutely nothing. They would have destroyed your financial future completely, David added quietly. A cash-out refinance of that size would carry massive monthly payments. Trayvon has no income. Deanna has no income. They would never have been able to make the payments on the new loan. Your house would have fallen into foreclosure within 6 months. They would have lost your property anyway, but it would have bought them enough time to clear Trayvon's federal wire fraud charges and save your parents' home. You were entirely disposable to them. You were collateral damage. The words hung in the air. Collateral damage. For 29 years, I had internalized their neglect. I had convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I built a bigger business, if I bought a nicer house, I would finally earn a seat at their table. I thought their favoritism toward Deanna was just a blind spot, a flaw in their parenting. I never realized it was a calculated hierarchy where my survival was always subordinate to hers. My mother sat at that restaurant wearing her church pearls, smiling at me, and asked me to hand over the keys to my kingdom. She quoted scripture. She talked about the blessings of family. She had the absolute nerve to go on Facebook the very next morning and publicly assassinate my character to our entire church congregation, painting herself as a grieving, righteous matriarch. And the entire time she knew she was handing me a financial death sentence. She knew she was pushing me off a cliff to break Deanna's fall. She weaponized our shared faith and the tight-knit structure of our community to isolate me, hoping the social pressure would force me to sign away my life savings before the bank seized her own house. My father pounded his fist on the table and threatened to destroy my public relations agency. He called me selfish. He called me a disgrace. He looked me in the eye and demanded I honor his non-existent legal claim to my wealth. He did all of that knowing he was the one who had recklessly gambled away his own home. He tried to intimidate me into paying for his massive, humiliating failure because his fragile ego could not handle the reality of his mistake. They were perfectly willing to let me lose everything I had built so they could maintain the illusion that they were a flawless, successful family. I stood up from the table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I could see the distant green canopy of Buckhead, the neighborhood where my beautiful 6-bedroom house sat. The house I had bled for. The house I had sacrificed my youth to buy. They thought they could just take it from me because I had always been the quiet one. I had always been the one who took the high road. I turned back to face Sterling and David, the last remnants of my familial loyalty. The tiny lingering doubt that maybe I was being too harsh evaporated entirely. The woman who walked into this office was a daughter looking for a defense. The woman standing here now was an executioner. Sterling. I said, my voice ringing with an absolute chilling calm. The trap you mentioned earlier. The strategy of letting them file a frivolous lawsuit to force them into the discovery process. We are doing it. I want them to commit perjury on public record. Sterling offered a dark, approving nod. They will undoubtedly file the summons by the end of the week. Mr. Gable, their discount attorney, will try to bully us with a demand letter. When he does, we will request a formal mediation meeting. And at that meeting, I said, walking back to the table and placing my hands flat against the polished wood, we are not just going to defend my property. We are going to expose every single lie they have told. I want my parents to look at these documents. I want Trayvon to see that we have his federal wire fraud file. I want Deanna to realize that her perfect life is entirely funded by theft. You want total annihilation, Sterling stated. It was not a question. I want them to understand the exact price of trying to destroy me, I replied. They thought I was a stepping stone. They are about to find out I am a landmine. Prepare the files, Sterling. When they ask for a mediation, give it to them. We are going to let them walk right into the boardroom, and then we are going to lock the doors. I gathered my things and walked out of the office ready for war. I returned to my agency with a singular icy focus. The revelation about my father's cross-collateralization had burned away any remaining hesitation. I spent Thursday afternoon directing my team, reviewing campaign metrics, and completely ignoring the barrage of missed calls from my mother. Friday arrived with heavy rain, the Atlanta skies matching the storm brewing within my family. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when my receptionist buzzed my office line, her voice laced with confusion. She told me there was a gentleman at the front desk insisting on handing a package directly to me. I knew exactly what it was. I walked out to the sleek reception area, my heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. A man in a damp windbreaker handed me a thick manila envelope, asked me to confirm my name, and walked out without another word. I was officially being sued by my own parents. I took the envelope back to my office, locked the door, and sat at my desk. I sliced the top open with a silver letter opener and pulled out the stack of legal documents. The header at the top of the first page proudly displayed the name of the law firm. It was the law office of Robert Gable. I knew the name because I had driven past his office a dozen times. It was wedged between a discount liquor store and a failing laundromat in a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city. He was the kind of lawyer who advertised on late-night local television promising aggressive representation for slip-and-fall accidents. My father, in his desperate arrogance, had likely chosen him because he was cheap and willing to file whatever baseless claims my father dictated. I read through the summons and complaint, genuinely astounded by the sheer legal incompetence printed on the pages. Mr. Gable had drafted a lawsuit built entirely on delusion. The document demanded the immediate surrender of my Buckhead property based on something he vaguely termed equitable familial interest. There were entire paragraphs dedicated to detailing how my father had provided emotional and financial support during my formative years, effectively claiming that raising a child gave him a permanent lien on my future assets. The complaint actually cited a verbal familial agreement, claiming that I had implicitly promised to provide housing for my older sister in exchange for my parents co-signing the lease on my very first apartment a decade ago. It was legally laughable. There was no mention of the $247,000 I had personally paid in mortgage installments. There was no mention of Trayvon's trespassing arrest. It was just a desperate, legally hollow demand letter dressed up as a formal lawsuit, threatening to drag me into a lengthy public court battle if I did not sign the quitclaim deed within 7 days. The paperwork went on to allege a breach of implied familial duty, a term that I was fairly certain Mr. Gable had entirely invented to appease my father's bruised ego. They were attempting to codify emotional manipulation into state law. It was a fascinating look into the psychology of my parents. They truly believed that giving birth to me and fulfilling the basic legal requirements of providing food and shelter during my childhood meant they owned the deed to my adulthood. They viewed my financial success not as an independent achievement, but as an extension of their own portfolio, ready to be liquidated whenever the golden child made a mistake. I placed the documents face down on my glass desk, took a slow, steady breath, and pressed the scanner button. I emailed the entire packet directly to Sterling Pierce with a subject line that simply read, "The Bluff." Less than 5 minutes later, my private line rang. I picked it up and was immediately greeted by the sound of Sterling actually laughing. It was a rich, booming sound that completely broke his usual cold corporate demeanor. Zuri Sterling chuckled, his voice echoing slightly over the speakerphone. I have been practicing corporate law in the state of Georgia for nearly 30 years. I have litigated against some of the most ruthless legal minds in the country. This document is without a doubt the most spectacularly incompetent piece of legal fiction I have ever had the pleasure of reading. Your father's attorney spelled equitable wrong twice in the opening paragraph. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. It is a shakedown, I said flatly. They know they do not have a case. They are banking on the fact that I have always hated public confrontation. My father thinks that if he threatens to drag my name through the county court system, I will quietly surrender the house just to make the embarrassment go away. He is treating me like one of his scared teenage daughters, not a business owner. Exactly. Sterling agreed, his tone sobering slightly, though the amusement still lingered. Any judge with a pulse would throw this out with prejudice at the first preliminary hearing. I can draft a motion to dismiss right now. We can file for sanctions against Mr. Gable for bringing a frivolous lawsuit, and we can countersue for legal fees. I can have this entire circus shut down by Tuesday. We can crush them immediately. I looked out the window at the rain lashing against the glass. Crushing them immediately was the logical move. It was the safe move. But shutting down the lawsuit would not stop them. If I simply dismissed the case, my parents would spin the narrative again. They would tell the entire church congregation that I used my expensive high-powered attorney to silence them. They would claim they were the victims of an unfair legal system. Trayvon would still be hiding his federal wire fraud, and my father would still be pretending he was a righteous patriarch instead of a man who gambled away his family home. If I just swatted them away, they would never face the reality of what they had done. They needed to be exposed fully and completely, in a setting where they could not run away from the truth. "No," I said softly. My voice was calm, anchored by a deep, unwavering resolve. "Do not file the motion to dismiss. Do not shut it down." Sterling paused. The line was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his tone completely shifting back to the sharp, calculated predator I had hired. "You want to let them proceed." "I want to set a trap," I explained, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. "If we crush them now, they will just retreat and play the victim from afar. I want them in a room. I want Trayvon Deanna, my mother, and my father sitting across a table from us, completely convinced that they have won. I want them to look me in the eye and make their demands while we are holding the evidence of their federal crimes. I want them to feel the absolute highest peak of arrogance right before we drop the floor out from under them." I could almost hear the gears turning in Sterling's mind. "A mediation," he suggested, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, a formal mediation," I confirmed. "Call Mr. Gable. Tell him that I received the summons and that I am incredibly distressed. Tell him that I want to avoid a public trial at all costs because I am worried about the reputation of my public relations agency. Make it sound like his bluff worked perfectly. Tell him we want to schedule a closed-door mediation session at your office next week to discuss the peaceful transfer of the property." "It is brilliant," Sterling admitted. "By agreeing to a mediation, we bypass the court system entirely for now. It keeps the proceedings private, which prevents them from playing to an audience. And more importantly, it gives them a false sense of absolute security. They will walk into that boardroom thinking you are terrified of Mr. Gable's lawsuit. They will drop their guard completely. And when they do," I said, my grip tightening on the edge of the desk, "we will execute the massacre. We will lay out the wire fraud, the defaulted commercial loan, and the cross-collateralization of my parents' house. We will not just defend my property. We will force them to abandon their claim under the threat of federal prosecution." "Consider the trap set," Sterling replied, the predatory edge fully returning to his voice. "I will draft a response to Mr. Gable this afternoon. I will make sure it is dripping with exactly the kind of legal hesitation that a cheap lawyer will interpret as fear. I will request the mediation for next Thursday. That gives my forensic team plenty of time to finalize the financial binders and perfectly organize the evidence of Trayvon's fraud." I hung up the phone and let out a long, slow breath. The physical sensation of anxiety that used to accompany any conflict with my family was completely gone. The little girl who used to cry in her pale blue bedroom, desperate for her mother's approval and terrified of her father's wrath, no longer existed. My parents had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and demanding my submission. Now they were going to pay for it. I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting my own piece of bait. Sterling was handling the legal deception, but I needed to handle the emotional deception. If this trap was going to work flawlessly, my family needed to hear the surrender directly from me. They needed to believe that their psychological warfare, the relentless text messages, the social media smear campaign, the home invasion, had finally broken my spirit. I opened a blank document on my computer and began typing an email to my mother. I crafted every sentence meticulously, burying my pride and adopting the exact tone of a defeated, exhausted daughter begging for peace. I was preparing to play the victim, knowing full well I was the executioner. "Dear Mom and Dad." I typed the words slowly, watching the black cursor blink against the glaring white background of the screen. I paused, letting my fingers hover over the keyboard. If I sounded too formal, my mother would suspect a trap. If I sounded too angry, my father would dig his heels in. I needed to sound utterly exhausted. I needed to sound like the dutiful, broken daughter they had spent 29 years conditioning me to be. I continued typing, choosing every word with surgical precision. The last few days have been incredibly overwhelming. I never wanted things to escalate to the point of police involvement, and seeing the lawsuit from Mr. Gable today was the breaking point. I cannot handle this stress anymore. It is affecting my health and my business. I do not want to fight my own family in a public courtroom. You win. I just want peace. Sterling Pierce. My attorney will be reaching out to Mr. Gable to schedule a private mediation next Thursday at his office. Let us just sit down with the lawyers and figure out the transfer of the property so we can all move on. Please tell Deanna I am sorry for the stress. I read the email 3 times. It was a masterpiece of submission. It stroked my father's ego by acknowledging his legal threat as the breaking point, and it fed my mother's martyr complex by giving her the apology she craved. It was exactly what they wanted to hear. I took a deep breath and clicked send. I leaned back in my chair and watched the clock in the corner of my computer screen. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. My phone remained silent. I knew exactly what was happening in the suburbs. My mother was likely reading the email aloud in her kitchen. My father was probably pacing the floor, puffing his chest out, taking full credit for my surrender, because his brilliant legal strategy had terrified me into compliance. Deanna was probably already browsing online for new nursery furniture. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was not a text message or an email response. It was a Facebook notification. I opened the app and there it was. My mother had taken a screenshot of my private email, cropped out my email address, and posted it directly to her public timeline for her 400 friends and our entire church congregation to see. She could not resist the opportunity to gloat. She needed the public validation of her victory. Her caption was a sickening display of weaponized religion and toxic pride. It read, "Praise the Lord. God is so good. Let this be a testament to the absolute power of a mother's prayer." The devil tried to divide our family this week. He tried to fill my youngest daughter's heart with greed and selfishness, but we stood firm in our faith. We practiced tough love, and the Lord has finally softened Zuri's heart. She has seen the error of her ways and agreed to do the right thing for her pregnant sister. We will be finalizing the paperwork next week to get Deanna and Trevon into their beautiful new home. Thank you to everyone at the church who prayed for us during this dark season. Family always wins in the end. God bless. The comments poured in almost instantly. Aunt Ruby wrote, "Amen, Brenda. I knew that girl would come to her senses once she realized she could not fight her own blood. God is working on her." A deacon from the church chimed in. "What a beautiful testimony of forgiveness. You are a strong mother, Brenda." And my cousin Marcus, who still owed me money, commented, "Glad to see Zuri finally stepping up. That house is going to be perfect for the new baby." I sat in my quiet office reading through the comments with a chilling detachment. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the massive hole I was about to blow in the hull. My mother's public gloating was the final nail in her own coffin. She had just broadcasted her extortion to the entire world. When the truth came out, when Trevon was led away in handcuffs and the bank seized her suburban house, she would have absolutely nowhere to hide. Her own Facebook post would stand as a monument to her greed. While my family was busy throwing a virtual parade in honor of their successful manipulation, a very different kind of work was happening in downtown Atlanta. Sterling Pierce was not resting. He was not just preparing a defense for a simple property dispute. He was executing the shadow moves we had discussed, arming the nuclear options that would guarantee my family's total destruction. I received a secure encrypted email from David Sterling's lead forensic accountant. The subject line was simply, "The packages are delivered." I opened the message and read the brief status update. Sterling had taken this heavily documented file detailing Trevon's $470,000 commercial loan fraud and split it into 2 distinct packages. The first package was sent directly to the Fraud Prevention Department of the Chicago-based lending syndicate. Sterling did not just send them a tip, he sent them the forged tax returns, the fake bank letters of credit, and the exact routing numbers showing where Trevon had wired their money into the offshore cryptocurrency exchange. He provided the syndicate with irrefutable proof that they were victims of a massive financial crime, giving them all the ammunition they needed to initiate immediate federal action. But Sterling did not stop there. High-risk lending syndicates sometimes try to handle things internally to recover their funds without involving the government. Sterling wanted to ensure that Traven had absolutely zero chance of escaping. The second package was sent directly to the White Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Atlanta. Sterling had a contact there, a senior agent he had worked alongside during a massive corporate embezzlement case a few years prior. Sterling forwarded the entire dossier under the formal pretext of reporting a severe instance of interstate wire fraud and bank fraud. He highlighted the fact that Trayvon had crossed state lines to secure the loan and used digital wire transfers to move the stolen funds, triggering federal jurisdiction. The trap was officially armed. The timers were set. By the time Thursday arrived, Trayvon would be under active federal investigation. The syndicate would be moving to secure their remaining collateral, which meant my father's house. And the most beautiful part of the entire strategy was that my family would walk into the boardroom completely blind. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so intoxicated by the idea of stealing my multi-million-dollar house, that they had stopped looking over their own shoulders. I closed my laptop and stood up, walking over to the large mirror hanging on the wall of my office. I looked at the woman staring back at me. I was 29 years old. I had built a successful public relations firm from the ground up. I had purchased a luxury home in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. I had done it all while carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's constant disapproval. For my entire life, my parents had treated me like an understudy in the grand production of Deanna's perfect life. They had cast me in the role of the quiet, obedient provider. When they demanded my house, they assumed I would just read my lines and step aside. They thought my email was a surrender. They thought my request for a mediation was an act of cowardice. They did not realize that I was no longer playing the part they had written for me. I was the director now. The weekend passed in a surreal, quiet blur. I did not answer any phone calls. I ignored the cheerful, patronizing text messages from Deanna, who had the absolute audacity to ask if I wanted to help her pick out paint colors for the nursery in my house. I did not respond. My silence only fueled their confidence. They interpreted my lack of communication as a sulking acceptance of my defeat. On Monday morning, Sterling called me to confirm that Mr. Gable had officially accepted our invitation for mediation. The cheap lawyer had eagerly agreed to a Thursday morning meeting at Sterling's office. Gable had even sent over a condescending email advising Sterling to make sure I had my pen ready to sign the quitclaim deed, completely unaware that he was marching his own clients into an ambush that would likely end his legal career. "We have them exactly where we want them," Zuri Sterling said, his voice smooth and incredibly dangerous over the phone. The syndicate received the file. The federal authorities have opened a preliminary inquiry into Apex Holdings. By the time your family sits down in my boardroom on Thursday, the walls will already be closing in on them. They just will not know it yet. Make sure the boardroom has a projector. Sterling, I replied, my voice steady and cold. I do not want them to just hear the truth. I want them to see it blown up in massive letters right in front of their faces. I want my father to read his own foreclosure notice on a 10-foot screen. It is already set up, Sterling assured me. We have a digital presentation ready. Every forged document, every defaulted loan, and every piece of collateral will be put on full display. I have also prepared the formal complaint against Mr. Gable. The moment he tries to enforce that fraudulent summons, I am going to hand him his own professional death warrant. Good, I said. I will see you on Thursday morning. I hung up the phone. The waiting game was almost over. My mother was continuing to post daily updates on her Facebook page, basking in the praise of her church friends. She was planning a massive family dinner for Friday night to celebrate the official acquisition of my house. She was busy ordering catering and buying decorations. She had no idea that by Friday night, her son-in-law would likely be back in handcuffs, and she would be packing her own belongings into cardboard boxes. They had pushed me to the absolute edge. They had orchestrated a home invasion, launched a public smear campaign, and filed a frivolous lawsuit to steal my property. They had done everything in their power to break me, but they had failed. I was not broken. I was weaponized, and I was ready for Thursday. Thursday morning broke with a glaring, unyielding sunlight that reflected harshly off the glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. I arrived at Pearson Associates at 9 o'clock sharp wearing a tailored crimson blazer. It was a deliberate choice. Crimson was the color of power, the color of absolute authority, and the color of a woman who was no longer afraid of her own blood. I walked directly to the 40th floor boardroom where Sterling was already waiting. The room was expansive, dominated by a massive mahogany conference table polished to a mirror finish. Heavy leather chairs lined the perimeter. At the far end of the room, an 85-inch blank white wall waited in silence. Sterling was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, looking completely relaxed. In front of him sat a single neatly organized stack of manila folders. There was no coffee service. There were no pastries or bottles of water set out for our guests. We were not hosting a family reunion. We were hosting an execution. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. My family walked in, and the sheer arrogance radiating from them was almost palpable. Mr. Gable entered first, leading the pack. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting brown suit that looked completely out of place in the luxurious corporate environment of Sterling's firm. He carried a scuffed leather briefcase and wore a smug, self-satisfied expression, clearly believing he had successfully bullied a wealthy business owner into submission with his legal fiction. Right behind him was my father Desmond. He walked with his chest puffed out, his shoulders squared, surveying the expensive boardroom with a look of pure entitlement. He locked eyes with me instantly, his gaze hard and unforgiving, trying to assert his dominance from across the room. He wanted me to know that he was the victor, the patriarch who had successfully brought his rebellious daughter to heel. My mother Brenda followed him. She was dressed in a pastel yellow dress, clutching her designer handbag, playing the role of the benevolent peacemaker. She offered me a tight, sorrowful smile, a perfectly calculated expression designed to show that she forgave me for my temporary lapse in family loyalty. Then came Deanna and Trayvon. Deanna waddled in, placing both hands firmly on her pregnant belly, looking around the room as if she were inspecting a property she already owned. She actually smirked at me when she pulled out her chair. Trayvon took the seat next to her. He had somehow managed to scrape together the $200 to bond out of the county jail because he was no longer wearing an orange jumpsuit. Instead, he was back in his designer clothes, his fake gold Rolex glinting under the recessed lighting. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, looking at me with an expression of sheer contempt and victory. He genuinely believed his little home invasion stunt had worked. They arranged themselves on the opposite side of the mahogany table. The physical divide between us felt like a chasm. On their side sat delusion, entitlement, and fraud. On our side sat the cold, hard, inescapable truth. Mr. Gable cleared his throat, loudly breaking the heavy silence in the room. He unlatched his cheap briefcase, the metallic click echoing off the glass walls. He pulled out a small stack of papers and smoothed them down on the table. "Good morning, Mr. Gable," began, his voice dripping with an unearned sense of professional superiority. "I am glad we could all come together today to resolve this unfortunate family misunderstanding without the messiness of a public trial. Litigation is ugly, it is expensive, and it tears families apart. Your parents have expressed a deep desire to handle this quietly, out of respect for your career and your reputation, Ms. Zuri." I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on Mr. Gable, my face a completely unreadable mask. Sterling sat silently beside me, his hands folded neatly over his files. Mr. Gable slid the top document from his stack. It was the quitclaim deed legally drafted to transfer the total ownership of my 6-bedroom mansion directly into Deanna's name. He placed his hand flat on the paper and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of me. "We have prepared the necessary paperwork to execute the transfer of the Buckhead property." Mr. Gable continued tapping the signature line with his index finger. "Once you sign this, the lawsuit will be immediately withdrawn with prejudice. You can return to your business, and your sister can begin preparing her home for the new baby. It is the best outcome for everyone involved. Just sign on the dotted line and we can all put this ugly business behind us." My father leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. "You made the right choice, Zuri," he said, his voice laced with patronizing authority. "I told you that you could not fight family. I am glad you finally realized that your selfishness was tearing your mother apart. Now sign the paper so we can get out of here. Deanna chimed in, her voice sickly sweet. Thank you, Zuri. I know this was hard for you, but Trayvon and I really appreciate you stepping up for the baby. We will invite you over for dinner once the nursery is finished. The absolute audacity of her offer almost made me laugh. They were sitting there attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar asset that I had paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears, and they were treating it like I was handing over a borrowed sweater. They expected me to be grateful for a future dinner invitation in my own dining room. I looked down at the quitclaim deed resting on the table. The stark black ink outlined the complete surrender of my financial independence. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen that Sterling had placed beside the document. The entire family leaned in slightly, their eyes locked on the pen. I could see the greedy anticipation radiating from Trayvon. I could see the smug validation on my father's face. My mother let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. They thought they had won. They thought the nightmare of Trayvon's debt was finally over. I held the pen over the signature line. I let the silence stretch for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I wanted them to savor this exact moment. I wanted them to feel the absolute highest peak of their false victory. Then I looked up. I locked eyes with Trayvon. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp, terrifying smile. I opened my fingers. The heavy gold pen dropped from my hand. It hit the polished mahogany table with a loud, sharp clatter that made Deanna physically jump in her seat. The pen rolled away from the unsigned deed, coming to a stop near the center of the table. I am not signing anything, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the lethal force of a loaded weapon. My father's face instantly flushed red with rage. "What kind of game are you playing?" he barked, slamming his hand on the table. "You brought us all the way down here. I did not bring you down here to sign a deed." "Dad?" I interrupted, my voice slicing through his anger effortlessly. "I brought you down here to show you exactly what happens when you try to extort me." I gave a slight nod to Sterling. Sterling did not say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a small black remote, and pressed a single button. The motorized blackout blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows instantly descended, plunging the bright boardroom into a dramatic, heavy dimness. Before my family could even process the sudden change in lighting, the projector mounted on the ceiling whirred to life. A massive 85-inch beam of light hit the blank wall directly behind Sterling and me. The high-definition projection illuminated the entire room. The first slide was not a legal threat. It was a massive blown-up spreadsheet showing the internal accounting records of Apex Holdings. Right at the top, highlighted in glowing red, was the name Trayvon. Directly beneath his name was the total sum of the commercial loan he had fraudulently obtained. $470,000. Trayvon's smug expression vanished in a fraction of a second. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His jaw dropped and his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared at the exact financial figures he had spent the last 7 months desperately trying to hide. "What is this?" Mr. Gable demanded, looking back and forth between the screen and his clients. "What does this have to do with the property?" Sterling pressed the button again. The slide transitioned. Now the wall displayed the heavily redacted but entirely legible copies of Trayvon's forged tax returns and the fake bank letters of credit he had used to secure the loan. Next to them were the wire transfer receipts showing $200,000 being dumped into the fraudulent offshore cryptocurrency exchange. "That is federal wire fraud, Trayvon," I said, my voice echoing in the dim room. "That is the $470,000 you stole from a high-risk lending syndicate in Chicago. That is the money you blew on fake investments, your leased Porsche, and the fake Rolex currently sitting on your wrist." Deanna turned to her husband, her face completely pale. "Trayvon, what is she talking about? What is Apex Holdings? What loan?" Trayvon could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit that did not exist. My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is a distraction. Turn that off right now. You are making things up to get out of signing the deed." You think I'm making this up, Dad? I asked, my voice rising just enough to command absolute silence. Let us talk about what you made up. Let us talk about the real reason you demanded my house. I nodded at Sterling again. He pressed the button. The screen transitioned for a third time. This time, Trayvon's name was gone. Instead, the projection displayed a heavily stamped legal document with my father's signature clearly visible at the bottom. It was the cross-collateralization agreement. Right next to it was the formal notice of default and intent to foreclose from the bank. The address listed on the foreclosure notice was not my mansion in Buckhead. It was my parents' house in the suburbs. My mother let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She slapped both of her hands over her mouth, staring in absolute horror at the document projected on the wall. Brenda, who had spent the entire week parading her righteousness on Facebook, was now looking at the legal notice that proved she was weeks away from being entirely homeless. My father froze. The towering, intimidating patriarch who had threatened to ruin my business suddenly looked incredibly small. His knees seemed to give out, and he slowly sank back down into his leather chair, his eyes locked on the word foreclosure, illuminated in massive black letters. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was deafening. The fake reality they had built, the lies they had maintained, the vicious entitlement they had weaponized against me. It was all completely obliterated in less than 60 seconds. They were naked, exposed, and staring directly into the abyss of their own destruction. I let the silence hang for another long, agonizing moment. I wanted the reality of the projection on the wall to fully crush the remaining oxygen out of the room. I watched my father's jaw tremble. I watched my mother's eyes dart wildly around, looking for an escape that did not exist. Then I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the polished mahogany table. Let me explain exactly what is happening here, so there is absolutely no confusion. I began, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You did not invite me to dinner to celebrate Deanna bringing a baby into the world. You invited me because you were out of time. Trayvon took out a $470,000 commercial loan using fabricated tax returns and a hollow shell company. He blew the money on unregulated cryptocurrency and luxury rentals, trying desperately to play the part of a wealthy investor for his social media followers. When the lending syndicate realized he was a fraud and came knocking for their money, he panicked. He went to you, Dad. And you, in your infinite wisdom and blind favoritism, decided to put a lien on your own fully paid home to secure a forbearance on his fraudulent debt. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He just stared at the massive word foreclosure glowing on the wall. But Trayvon never got the money to pay them back, did he? I continued, my words hitting like physical blows. The 90 days ran out. The bank called the debt, and suddenly, you were the ones facing foreclosure. You were going to lose your home. So you hatched a brilliant plan. You decided to force me to sign over my mansion. You figured Deanna has clean credit. Once my 6-bedroom house was legally in her name, she could pull a massive cash-out refinance against my equity. You were going to use my hard-earned money to pay off Trayvon's syndicate and save your own house from foreclosure. You were going to saddle me with massive debt, ruin my credit, and steal the sanctuary I built from scratch, all to cover up a federal crime. Deanna let out a choked, horrific sob. She turned to look at her parents, her face a mask of genuine shock. She might have been entitled, but based on her reaction, she had no idea about the cross-collateralization. Trayvon just stared down at his lap, completely paralyzed by his own exposure. Mr. Gable, however, was not looking at the screen anymore. He was staring at Sterling. The cheap strip mall lawyer finally realized he was not sitting in a simple family mediation over a verbal contract. He was standing directly in the middle of a federal minefield. Sterling picked up a thick manila folder from his neatly organized stack and slid it across the table. It glided over the smooth wood and stopped precisely an inch from Mr. Gable's trembling hands. Mr. Gable, Sterling said, his voice as smooth and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. My forensic accounting team has already forwarded all of this evidence to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the Fraud Department of the Lending Syndicate in Chicago. What your clients failed to mention when they hired you to draft that incredibly laughable summons is that they are actively attempting to commit extortion to cover up federal wire fraud. Mr. Gable swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat traced its way down his forehead, catching the dim light of the projector. He slowly reached out and opened the folder. He read the first page, his eyes darting rapidly across the text. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. The confident, condescending legal persona he had carried into the room completely evaporated. I assure you, Mr. Pierce, I had absolutely no knowledge of these underlying financial circumstances. Gable stammered, his voice jumping an octave in sheer panic. I was retained for a simple property dispute based on familial agreements. That is all. I was not informed of any commercial loans or federal investigations. Sterling leaned back in his expensive leather chair, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying calm. Ignorance is a very fragile defense in front of a federal judge, Mr. Gable. By sending that summons and demanding my client surrender her property under the threat of litigation, you are acting as a direct accessory to their extortion. You are attempting to facilitate the transfer of high-value real estate to satisfy a fraudulent debt. If you do not withdraw that summons immediately, and if you do not leave this room right now, my next call will be directly to the Georgia State Bar. I will report you as a co-conspirator in a federal financial crime, and I will personally ensure your license to practice law is permanently revoked before the end of the week. Mr. Gable did not need to hear another word. The threat of disbarment and federal prison was enough to completely shatter his loyalty to a client who was likely paying him bargain bin rates. He frantically popped the brass latches on his scuffed briefcase. He reached out with shaking hands, snatched the quitclaim deed off the table and shoved it inside, crumpling the edges in his haste. Wait! My father panicked, standing up so fast his chair wobbled behind him. He reached out and grabbed Mr. Gable's sleeve. Where are you going? You cannot just leave us here. You are our lawyer. I paid your retainer. You work for me. Mr. Gable violently yanked his arm away from my father's grasp, looking at him with absolute unmasked disgust. I do not work for felons, Desmond. You lied to me. You used my firm to try and extort your own daughter to cover up a federal crime. You are completely on your own. Do not ever contact my office again. Mr. Gable snapped his briefcase shut, practically jogging backward toward the heavy oak doors. He did not look back at the family he was abandoning. He grabbed the brass handle, yanked the door open, and fled down the hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind him with a resounding click. That single sound was the final devastating blow. The arrogant facade my family had carried into the room shattered into a million irreparable pieces. There were no more empty threats of lawsuits. There was no more posturing about familial duty. They were utterly broken, legally defenseless, and trapped in a room with the daughter they had tried to destroy. My father, the imposing patriarch who had screamed at me in a crowded restaurant and threatened to ruin my professional reputation, suddenly slumped forward. The towering anger washed completely out of him, replaced by a pathetic, desperate fear. He looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. Zuri, he begged, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual booming authority. Zuri, please, you have to understand our position. We were desperate. The syndicate was going to take the house. We have lived there for 20 years. Where are your mother and I supposed to live at our age? You have so much money. You have a massive agency. You always figure things out. You are the strong one. We just needed you to carry this weight for a little while so we could fix it. You can afford to help us. We are family. My mother burst into loud, racking sobs. She abandoned her stoic, righteous matriarch persona entirely. She was no longer the woman posting triumphant scriptures on Facebook. She was a terrified woman staring at homelessness. Please, baby, she cried, reaching her trembling hands across the massive mahogany table toward me. We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot let them put Trayvon in a federal prison. Deanna is going to have a baby in 3 months. You cannot let your own nephew grow up without a father. Please, Zuri. I know we went about this the wrong way. We made a terrible mistake. But we are begging you on our hands and knees. Do not do this to us. Have mercy on your family. Deanna joined the chorus of despair, weeping hysterically and clutching her stomach as if trying to shield her unborn child from the consequences of her husband's actions. I did not know about the house, Zuri. I swear to God I did not know Dad put his house up. Trayvon told me it was just a regular business loan. Please do not let them take him away. I cannot be a single mother. Trevon remained completely silent. He sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead, his fake Rolex feeling incredibly heavy on his wrist. He knew there was nothing he could say. His fake empire had burned to the ground in less than 5 minutes. I sat perfectly still, my posture immaculate, listening to their pleas echo off the glass walls. For 29 years, the sound of my mother crying or my father begging would have broken my resolve. I would have set myself on fire just to keep them warm. I would have signed the deed and figured out a way to survive the crushing debt, all in the desperate pursuit of their conditional love. But looking at them now, all I felt was a profound, echoing emptiness. They were not crying because they regretted hurting me. They were crying because they got caught. They were sorry that their extortion plot failed, not that they had attempted it in the first place. Mercy, I repeated slowly, tasting the word on my tongue. The room went completely silent except for Deanna's soft hiccups. You are asking me for mercy. Where was your mercy when you sat at that expensive dinner table and demanded the house I worked 80-hour weeks to buy? Where was your mercy when you launched a public smear campaign on social media, turning our entire extended family and our church against me? Where was your mercy when Trayvon showed up at my front door with a moving truck ready to kick me out onto the street and replace my locks? My father flinched physically, shrinking back into his chair, unable to look me in the eye. You did not care if I ended up homeless. I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut through the room like shattered glass. You did not care if my credit was completely destroyed. You were perfectly fine with sacrificing my entire financial future just to maintain the illusion of Deanna's perfect life. You chose to protect a scammer over your own daughter. You bet your house on the lie, Dad, and you lost. I shifted my gaze to my older sister. And you, Deanna, you wanted my house so badly. You brought paint swatches to dinner. You planned out the nursery in a house you did not own. You thought you could just take what is mine because Mom and Dad have always handed you everything on a silver platter. Well, they have absolutely nothing left to hand you. Your husband is a fraud, and your parents are bankrupt. I turned my cold gaze back to my weeping parents. You are my parents, yes. You gave me life, but you do not own it, and I refuse to let you destroy my life to save yourselves. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, the movement slow and deliberate. I reached down and calmly buttoned the center button of my crimson blazer, smoothing out the fabric. The room felt incredibly light now, as if a thick, suffocating fog had finally been forcefully pulled through the ventilation system. My parents continued to cry their tears, a pathetic mixture of fear and self-pity. My father kept his head bowed, staring at the polished mahogany table as if hoping a trapdoor would open and swallow him whole. There is nothing left to discuss, I said, my voice projecting a final, absolute authority. I am not signing the deed. I am not taking out a loan. I am not giving you a single dollar to clean up this catastrophic mess. You made your bed with this man, and now you are going to lose everything sleeping in it. Get out of my sight. For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer shock of my rejection paralyzed them. Then Sterling stepped forward, walking over to the heavy oak doors and pulling them wide open. He stood by the exit, gesturing politely down the hallway. The meeting is over, Sterling announced, his tone clinical and completely detached. I suggest you vacate the premises before building security is called to escort you out. Slowly, like wounded animals, they stood up. My mother leaned heavily on my father, her legs trembling so violently she could barely walk. My father looked physically aged, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. Deanna grabbed Trayvon by the arm, dragging him upward. Trayvon moved like a ghost, his eyes glassy and vacant. He did not say a single word. He did not look at me. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone. They shuffled out of the boardroom in a miserable, silent procession. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the street far below. I knew exactly what was waiting for them on the ground floor. Sterling had perfectly timed the delivery of the evidence packages. The elevator ride down must have been the longest 40 floors of their entire lives. When the silver doors finally slid open in the expansive marble lobby of the Pearson Associates building, they did not find the exit. They found reality. Two men wearing dark suits and stern expressions stepped directly into their path. They flashed federal badges. They were special agents from the White-Collar Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Trayvon did not even try to run. He simply raised his hands as the agents read him his rights regarding federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Deanna collapsed against a marble pillar, screaming hysterically as the agents placed the cold steel handcuffs on her husband's wrists in the middle of a crowded corporate lobby. My parents could only watch in stunned, helpless horror as the federal agents led Trayvon out the revolving glass doors and pushed him into the back of a black government vehicle. The fake empire was officially dismantled. 6 months have passed since that day in the boardroom. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. Trayvon is currently sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial. He was denied bail because the judge deemed him a severe flight risk due to his offshore cryptocurrency ties. His court-appointed public defender has already indicated that Trayvon is facing a minimum of 8 to 10 years in federal prison. My parents faced a slightly different kind of prison. The Chicago lending syndicate did exactly what they promised. They foreclosed on the suburban house. The bank seized the property, changed the locks, and auctioned it off to cover Trayvon's massive defaulted loan. My parents lost the home they had lived in for 2 decades. They lost their pristine credit scores, their retirement savings, and their massive egos. Today, my father and my mother are living in a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city. Deanna lives with them. She gave birth to a baby boy 2 months ago. Now my mother spends her days changing diapers in a tiny living room while my father works late shifts as a retail manager just to help cover their basic utility bills. Deanna does not post on Instagram anymore. The fake designer clothes have been sold to pay for groceries. They are trapped together in a miserable, claustrophobic reality entirely of their own making. They have not reached out to me, and I have not reached out to them. The bridge is completely burned and the ashes have blown away. As for me, I am currently sitting on the expansive balcony of my Buckhead mansion. The evening air is warm and fragrant. I am holding a glass of expensive red wine, watching the sunset cast a brilliant orange glow over the Atlanta skyline. My public relations agency has doubled its revenue in the last 2 quarters. My peace of mind is absolute and unshakable. People in our community often preach that blood is thicker than water. They use that phrase as a weapon, a guilt trip designed to force successful Black women to carry the dead weight of toxic family members. But they forget that water is essential for life, and infected blood will eventually kill you. You do not owe your sanity to people who only view you as a resource. You do not owe your hard-earned sanctuary to people who would gladly burn it down to keep themselves warm. Cutting off a toxic bloodline is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. I had to let them fall so I could finally fly. Have you ever had to let your family face the consequences of their own actions? Sound off in the comments and don't forget to subscribe.